The German high seas fleet went back into port and they never came out. The Grand Fleet was ready for action the next morning. Now that's the difference, and that really is the importance of Jutland. So although people argue and say, well, it was a defeat. Yeah, up to a point it was.
Oh, do people argue it's a defeat, Gordon?
Oh
Because
yeah,
I've always thought it was a draw.
Well, some people say it was a defeat, and they say, British lose, I think it's something like 5,000 sailors, and Germans lose a lot less, British lose more ships. But it was it was a victory, no question. It was the last time the German Navy tried to go to sea was when they were ordered out in 1918 and they mutinied and they didn't go. So that was the importance. But certainly there were, I mean, BTM said at some stage during the battle, there's something wrong with our bloody ships today.
Hello and welcome to the pod. Gordon's back as we discuss great British commanders of World War One, and as you heard at the top there, we're going Navy as well as Army. So the list of generals, admirals and one junior officer is as follows. Admirals Jellicoe and Beatty, Generals Plumer and Allenby, Major T.E. Lawrence, Generals Chetwood and Maud, and my personal favourite, Field Marshal Sir William Robertson, the only man ever to rise from private to the top rank in an era not well known for social mobility. We get a few digressions in this chat, and we do talk Alanbrooke. Well, yes, I know you're thinking he's World War II, and he is, but listeners had quite rightly mentioned that we didn't go into too much detail in our earlier episodes, so we cover that. Links are in the show notes, including those previous episodes where we've covered Field Marshal Haig and the World War II commanders. Do get in touch with questions and comments, always happy to hear from listeners. Lots more great history to come, and do check out Spy Masters, our sister podcast. But until then, I'm going to hand you over to me and Gordon discussing great British World War I commanders. Gordon, welcome back to the pod on commanders of the 20th century. World War I also rans. Thank you.
Not at all. Nice to be here again.
And so last time, for listeners' benefit, we had the World War II also rans. And so we thrashed out our favoured ones of the Second World War. Poor old Monty got a good kicking. Auchinleck we're huge fans of. Bomber Harris we're huge fans of. And Alexander we're huge fans of. But one commander of the Second World War that I just thought we were probably overlooked or we mentioned, but not in any great detail. And this is off the back of user comments, Gordon. We were picked up on by some listeners. And we didn't really discuss Alanbrooke much. So I thought before we get going on the First World War, chaps, we can get cracking we can deal with Alanbrooke. And I'm a huge fan of his ever since I read Andrew Roberts' book, Masters and Commanders, in which he writes about Churchill and Alanbrooke and then Roosevelt and Marshall. He comes across very well in that account. And so as a result, I mean, I've always been a huge fan of his, and I sense you are as well.
Well, he was an incredibly important and influential figure in the Second World War. He was chief of the General Staff, chief of the Imperial General Staff for most of the Second World War. And therefore, he's incredibly important, and we certainly should consider him. I think as a man, he probably wouldn't be the sort of chap you'd necessarily want to sit next to at dinner, because he was from that rather black Protestant, dour, Northern Irish birth.
This is my family you're talking about here.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was born there. As the great Duke said, being born in a stable doesn't make you a horse. But I mean, he was pretty dour and pretty boring, but incredibly influential. He took over from Dill. Now, Churchill sacked Field Marshal Dill, who was probably one of the more intellectual army officers of the time. And soldiering is not a cerebral profession, but Dill really was highly intelligent. Churchill sacked him because he wouldn't tell Churchill what Churchill wanted to hear. Churchill had all sorts of extraordinary ideas. He wanted to invade Schleswig-Holstein in 1940, and Dill said, Prime Minister, that's ridiculous. What would be the point? The Germans will just block it off. He then wanted to invade Sardinia, and again, Dill said, this is nonsense.
But
So
if you okay, well, I'm just going to bat for Churchill here.
mm,
If we'd gone into Schleswig-Holstein, we've got a foothold in Europe now, and it's behind where the Germans wouldn't expect it, would they? Because it's a bit of a left field attack.
well, they wouldn't expect it because they would realize that even the British are not quite as stupid as to do something like that. I mean, look at the map. All they would have done, they'd have simply blocked it off. I mean, it's a peninsula. Yeah, you couldn't have done anything, and you'd have had a hell of a trouble with supplying it. Very short route, not much divergence, German submarines and everything else. No, it would have been daft, and Dill realized it was daft. And ditto Sardinia. What are you going to do sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean? Even if you had the troops to do it. But Churchill wanted to get rid of Dill. He didn't quite think how he could do it. So what he did was he produced a new rule, because Churchill was his own Minister of Defence. And his new rule was that chiefs of the Imperial General Staff must resign at the age of 60. And Dill was 60 come Christmas 39. Churchill, by the way, was 62 at this time. So Dill was sacked and sent off to America, in fact, to liaise with the American chiefs of staff. Now, he went down exceedingly well in America. They thought very highly of him. He did a tremendously good job there getting the Americans on side, because a lot of American generals and admirals and airmen were really looking east. They thought Japan was a threat, and really Europe wasn't that important. Dill managed to persuade them that actually Europe, Germany, that was the problem. And in fact, he died in America. And I think he was the first foreigner, possibly the only foreigner, to be buried in Arlington. And it's an equestrian statue. I've been there, and it's most impressive. And Arlington, of course, is the military cemetery of the United States. And civilians don't. The only civilian, Kennedy is buried there, President Kennedy. But of course, President Kennedy had been in the United States Navy during the Second World War, which gave him credit, gave him the
Got him his berth.
right to be buried there. And Dill's statue, it's an equestrian statue. It's really most impressive on his grave. So Brooke says in his diary, he thought it was disgraceful. He thought it was frightful. He thought Dill was a jolly good chap, but he clearly didn't feel strong enough to refuse to jump into his shoes when Dill disappears. Now, Brooke's biggest problem throughout the war was trying to control Churchill, because Churchill had also the trouble with Churchill had 1,000 ideas, of which 999 were totally stupid, would never work. One was brilliant. And the job of Churchill's staff, including Brooke, was to find out which was the brilliant one, hidden amongst all the totally stupid and ridiculous ones. And Churchill did have some good ones. I mean, the Pluto pipeline under the ocean, the Mulberry Harbours, etc., etc. And Brooke's diary, from that point of view, is very interesting, because, of course, he can put in his diary things that he couldn't possibly say out loud, or couldn't necessarily say to the Prime Minister. But that was certainly one of his big problems. His other big problem, of course, was controlling de Gaulle. And he found de Gaulle very, very difficult. And again, he's very clear about that in his diary. The problem with de Gaulle was that de Gaulle was quite happy to let the Allies win the war, while he concentrated on inveigling himself to govern France after the war. And was a thorough nuisance. I mean, he particularly annoyed the British by adopting the Cross of Lorraine as the Free French logo. Well, of course, the Cross of Lorraine was last appeared by Joan of Arc, who was the mentally unstable teenager who was a thorough nuisance to the British during the 100 Years' War. So that sort of didn't go down terribly well.
That's just a mild irritant, though, isn't it? We're not going to get upset by something.
Well, people did get upset by it. They said, this is deliberate. This is rubbing our nose in it. We've rescued you. We've given you a home. The Americans were very anti-de Gaulle. They didn't want de Gaulle at all. They wanted to go for zero.
Churchill was probably de Gaulle's biggest cheerleader, wasn't he?
Well, up to a point. But Churchill says that I had many a cross to bear, but the most difficult of all was the Cross of Lorraine, which was his remarks about de Gaulle. But I mean, he was quite right to go for de Gaulle. De Gaulle, after all, had more credibility really than Giraud, because Giraud had sort of gone along with the Vichy setup for a bit, whereas de Gaulle hadn't. But apart from that, Brooke, one of my criticisms of Brooke is that he tended to look after his own. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. You obviously will promote people who you think are good, and the people you think are good are possibly people who've worked for you and you haven't sacked them, to put it simply. He was a great supporter of Montgomery when really he should have sacked Montgomery on a number of occasions, but he wouldn't, and he backed Montgomery. One thing that I think was very good of Brooke, when you're in that sort of position, the stresses are enormous. I mean, Brooke had to worry about the whole war, not just the war against Germany, but the war against Japan as well, and all the other things, the political side of it, dealing with allied governments and all the rest of it. And the stresses would be enormous. And many a lesser man would have driven himself into the ground. Brooke didn't. Brooke, every day, he'd go out to lunch in his club. Didn't matter what was happening. And weekends, off he'd go. And he was a great bird watcher. So he'd go off bird watching for the weekend. And then he'd come back. And that allowed him, I think, to last out the war. I mean, a lesser man would have probably not worked every hour God sends, gone without sleep, gone without food, certainly wouldn't have taken any time off and would have collapsed. He would have just gone. And that's a lesson, actually, that soldiers today really need to learn. Well, I hope they
Work-life balance. It's all the rage in corporate life now as well.
Yeah, well, it's very important. I mean, when I was second in command of a battalion, the commanding officer and I used to do command the battalion turnabout. If we were in the field, he would do 3 or 4 days and go off and get some sleep and some rest, and I would take over 3 or 4 days. Then I'd go off and get some rest, and that's the sensible thing to do. People who think that nobody is absolutely essential all the time. Nobody's irreplaceable, and this was something that Brooke realized, and not all generals at the time did. Montgomery, to be fair to him, and I don't like being fair to Montgomery, but Montgomery also realized that. Montgomery would go to bed every night in his caravan at bedtime, whatever, glass of Horlicks and off to bed. And he had strict instructions not to be disturbed until morning, unless, the whole world.
Yeah, the Germans are on the tent.
They're actually outside the tent flap. That's how you wake them up. And he's quite right. And Brooke realized this as well. I think his big disappointment was that he wasn't appointed as Supreme Commander for Overlord for the invasion of Northwest Europe in 1944. Churchill, very early on, had told him that when we go back to Europe, you will be the overall commander. Well, of course, by 1944, that just couldn't happen, because although the British landed more men on D-Day, on the 6th of June, more men than the Americans, from then on, the American buildup will be much, much, much greater. And eventually we would end up with only 2 British, well, 1 British, 1 Canadian oblique British army, so 2 armies, whereas the Americans eventually ended up with 5. So there'd be far more Americans. So the Supreme Commander had to be an American, and it was Eisenhower, which in my view was a very good choice. Eisenhower had no combat experience. He'd never been in battle, or he'd never commanded men in battle, but he was a facilitator. People liked him. He could get people working together. He could get people like Patton and Montgomery working together, and he was the right choice. This was a disappointment to Brooke. I think he understood why he couldn't have it, why he was let down, but it was, I think, a disappointment, because he hadn't had the opportunity. He'd been a corps commander in the retreat from Europe via Dunkirk, but that was his. I mean, he hadn't been an army commander. He would have liked, I think, to have been an army commander. He'd have loved to have been an army group commander, but there we are. Nevertheless, as chief of the Imperial General Staff, he had an enormous and very important contribution to make to the war, which he did. And I suppose if you had to put his major contributions. I'd say one, keeping Churchill under control, was probably the major one, and resisting sort of things like the attempts to, which we talked about, I think before, the attempts to sack Slim. Well, he wouldn't wear that. He wouldn't go along with that. So yeah, jolly important. But again, probably not the chap you'd want to go to the pub with.
Yeah, right. And if he had not, if he hadn't taken over from Dill, then when Dill was retired by Churchill, who were the other candidates?
Oh, very difficult to say, because one of the things that the British had recognized, and this goes back to bringing Auchinleck over from India, was that there was a great shortage. I mean, I suppose perhaps someone like Jumbo Wilson, someone like Alexander, perhaps bring him in. Alexander was a bit junior, but nevertheless.
Right.
So there were candidates, people who could have done it. Dill, of course, if he hadn't been sacked, would have done just as good a job. Although he would have probably, well, he would have fallen out with Churchill anyway.
He died of didn't he die of a heart attack?
Yeah, he did, and presumably would have died of a heart attack anyway.
Yeah, maybe even sooner if he had been, the stresses and strains of that job.
Quite possibly sooner. At least in America, he didn't have to worry about rationing and blackouts and big, the Blitz and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, no, I'm Alanbrooke or Alanbrooke later.
Well, let's clear this up, because many listeners might be confused. Why is he Alanbrooke, all one word, or Alan space Brooke?
His Christian name was Alan, and his surname was Brooke. Bravo Romeo Oscar Kilo Echo. When he was ennobled, he became Viscount Alanbrooke, all one word. And the present successor is Alanbrooke, all one word.
Is that happen? Is quite unusual in the ennobling process?
It is unusual. Yes, I mean, Oliver Webb Carter, all one word, would be rather odd if you were.
Yeah, I would.
That's
very strange.
I mean, whether there'd been somebody in the distant past.
Yes,
they were an influential family. I mean, the Brookboroughs are another branch of that family. Brookborough was the prime minister of the Northern Ireland government.
For County Fermanagh, I think
I think that's where they originated from. Yeah,
yeah.
I think Brooke went to school in England. I'm not sure where he went to school. I think he went to school in England. I think the family were more Anglo than Irish, if you see what I mean.
Yes, yes. Although many Anglo-Irish, Alexander, of course, who we discussed, and then Monty. Although we don't want to dwell on Monty for too long.
Well, I'm not sure Montgomery could be described as Anglo-Irish, although he did describe himself as such when it suited him. But I mean, yeah, for a time, Ireland used to be referred to as the East Prussia of the British Army, because there were an awful lot of people who came from there. And again, it's why did the Irish join the British Army? Because there's bugger all else to do. It was the impoverished part of the kingdom. Ditto the Highlands of Scotland. Impoverished.
I'm just, in case any listeners are spitting with rage, I've lost so many French. I don't want to lose any of the Irish listeners.
Well, hang on. I mean, I'm born in Ireland. I went to school there. I'm not anti-Irish. I'm simply explaining why historically and traditionally, the Irish have joined the British Army, and why the Highland Scots have joined the British Army, and why the East of England. The British Army traditionally has recruited from the impoverished parts of the kingdom, because there's nothing else to do. There aren't the industries, there isn't the employment. You join the army. That's what they did.
Yeah, not so many sort of people from the southeast and London, wealthier families.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you see, it's not, we're talking about Ireland, it's not just other ranks, it's officers as well. Because if you're born into a landed family, you have loads of children. There isn't enough land to go around. They can't all, so the land goes to the eldest son. And the rest have either got to go into the church or join the army. I mean, those were the options then.
Yes. Right. Okay. So I hope that's mollified those listeners who are upset that Brooke didn't get a mention last episode. Right. So I thought I would just carry on as I did before with a nice uninformed list of World War I commanders and you can tell me if I've missed anyone out, or if I've included someone and you think this is just the height of idiocy. So I have Edmund Allenby, did very
Yeah,
well in the Middle East,
yeah,
Lawrence of Arabia and all that.
yeah.
Herbert Plumer, a listener suggested Herbert Plumer. I have to confess, I hadn't heard of him, seen a picture of him though. He's got a wonderful moustache. And so that means he qualifies immediately. Philip Chetwood,
Mhm.
Henry Wilson,
Mhm.
assassinated after the war in a dastardly attack by actually a veteran of the Irish Guards.
Yeah, he was
And
an IRA gunman.
yes,
Wilson had become involved with the politics of Ireland, foolishly, I think.
yes,
He is the only field marshal to die in uniform with his sword in his hand, because he'd just come back from an investiture in Buckingham Palace, and he went to his flat, which I think was in Sloane Square or something like that. And he was in uniform, of course. And this chap came up and pointed a gun at him, and Wilson drew his sword and died. So I think he's
yes.
probably the only field marshal to ever die with a sword in hand and in uniform.
I think there's a recent account of his assassination. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar with this. I'll put a link in the show notes which challenges that account. But yes, it's a romantic vision of a field marshal charging a gunman
Well,
with a
we
sword,
do know that he was on his way back from an investiture,
and he had a sword. Yes,
and he would be in uniform, and in uniform you wore a sword. So,
yes,
you know,
yes.
perhaps it wasn't drawn, but,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, yes.
Indeed, indeed. So that's it. Those are the four I had of the army, and then I've got two admirals, John Jellicoe and David Beatty.
Yeah.
Jellicoe, the sort of supreme commander of the Royal Navy. I probably haven't got the title right. And David Beatty's the sort of dashing admiral of the fleet.
Yeah, he became First Lee Lord after Jellicoe. First Lee Lord is the professional head of the Navy. That was Jellicoe. And of course, Jellicoe commanded the Grand Fleet at Jutland, which is the one that everybody remembers. It was really the only big naval battle of that war.
And there's some controversy about it. So let's start with these two, Jellicoe and Beatty, because there's some controversy. Jellicoe is criticised for his caution at that at Jutland, which was the naval clash of the First World War, and Beatty's sort of slightly more of the sort of dashing type attacking commander. And I know you're quite sympathetic to Beatty.
Well, only because he went to my old school. um, he's another one that my old school was in Ireland. And Beatty, the Royal School Armagh, of which I am a product, was also where Beatty went, and also where Richard Wellesley, actually, Arthur Wellesley, elder brother, went there as well. Set up by King James I in 1604, with its aim of, and I quote from the charter, providing an English education to the sons of the Irish gentry. Now, I don't think many of us were gentry by the time I went there, but that's what they aimed to do.
Is it still open?
Oh yes, yes.
Oh,
well, yes, it certainly is. Now, the great thing about the Royal School of Armagh when I went there, which was in the 50s, it was entirely mixed. Unlike education in Northern Ireland, which is still to this day, I'm sorry to say, sector in the state sector. The public school sector wasn't, or at least mine certainly wasn't. So we had a lot of army kids there, of course, a lot of English kids, Catholic kids, Protestant kids, all sorts of things. Most of the staff were English. So this awful sectarianism wasn't absorbed by us, I'm very glad to say. Now, when my son was ready for common entrance, unfortunately, by that time, because of what they call the Troubles, obviously army kids didn't go there anymore. They'd had to be removed. A lot of kids from the south didn't go there anymore, and it had become really largely a sort of Protestant school. So I didn't send my son there. I sent my son to Sedbergh instead. If he'd been a bit brighter, I'd have sent him to Downside, but Sedbergh was a good sort of rugby playing school, so that's where he went. And then a few years later, I mean, not so long ago, they invited me to go back on a speech day thing and talk to them. And I discovered that it had gone back to what it was when I was there. The present headmaster is an ex-headmaster of Gordonstoun. It is once again mixed, lots of English kids, complete mix, as it was in my day. And I think it's now a jolly good school. And if I had another son, which I hope to God I will not that I have anything against sons, but at my age, I do not want any more small brats. Uh, but that's where I would send them now, partly because Irish public schools are considerably cheaper than English public schools. Certainly in my day, the food was appalling, but apart from that, it wasn't so bad. And that's where BT went. Now the difference between those two, of course, is that Jellicoe commanded the Grand Fleet at Jutland. BT commanded the battle cruiser squadron. Now the tactics were, you'll remember that in 1907, Dreadnought, the first all big gun battleship, cost, I can't remember what it cost, but they built it in something like 13 months by the Royal Navy, and overnight every other battleship was obsolete. The Germans then, previously, of course, they couldn't take, the Royal Navy was as big or bigger than the next three biggest navies. That was the policy. And the Germans realized that actually by producing the Dreadnought, then everybody now starts from a level basis because all the other battleships are obsolete. So the Germans started to build battleships, and they produced between 1907 and 1914, they produced something like 16 battleships. We produced lots more. And that's the naval arms race. That's one of the reasons Britain comes into the First World War, because why did the Germans want a blue water navy? They don't have an empire to protect. They don't rely on overseas trade. They don't import 30% of their food, as England does. Why do they need a blue water navy? The only reason they can want a blue water navy with all these battleships is to take on the Royal Navy at some stage in the future.
And they hadn't read the rules, which is that the Royal Navy is supreme on the waves in that period.
Well,
and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's the way it is. And so the tactic was you had the battleships fleet and the battle cruisers. Now, the battle cruisers, again, they were built to complement the dreadnoughts. They were a bit faster than the dreadnoughts. They equally had big guns, slightly less armor, so they could be a bit faster. And the idea of the battle cruisers, and BT commanded the battle cruiser squadron, that the battle cruisers, being faster than the main fleet, would find out where the enemy were and follow them. Not necessarily engage them in battle, but follow them until the main fleet came up. And that's what they tried to do. And it didn't really work. All sorts of reasons why. For a start, I think we've got some of the technology wrong. The system of ensuring that something exploding in a gun turret didn't go all the way down to the magazine, that hadn't been properly thought through. And a number of the casualties to British ships were because of that. The Germans actually had thought it through, and they had a system whereby if there was an explosion in a turret, it didn't then go all the way down to the magazine and blow the bloody ship up. Now, the British lost more ships and more men at the Battle of Jutland, but the difference is this. The German high seas fleet, went back into port and they never came out. The Grand Fleet was ready for action the next morning. Now, that's the difference, and that really is the importance of Jutland. So although, people argue and say, well, it was a defeat. Up to a point it was.
Oh, do people argue it's a defeat, Gordon? Because I'd always thought it was a draw.
Well, some people say it was a defeat, and they say, British lose, I think it's something like 5,000 sailors, and Germans lose a lot less, British lose more ships. But it was strategic, it was a victory, no question. It was the last time the German Navy tried to go to sea was when they were ordered out in 1918 and they mutinied and they didn't go. So that was the importance. But certainly there were, BTM said at some stage during the battle, there's something wrong with our bloody ships today. And there were things wrong technologically, which they then tried to put right before the next war. But of course, Lloyd George's policy of saying we can afford to take chances on defence, we can't afford to take chances on welfare, meant that really there wasn't enough money to really bring the Royal Navy up to date. So come World War II, it was still a huge navy, bigger than anybody else's. And certainly nothing that the Germans could do that would worry the Royal Navy terribly. But you did get examples of things that went wrong. You got the Hood and Repulse, ships being sent off to the Far East without air cover and that sort of thing. But but essentially, the Royal Navy still ruled the waves really right up until, well, when you think in 1956 for the Suez Caper, we deployed 8 aircraft carriers.
Wow.
8. And when I joined the army in 1960, we still had 8 aircraft carriers. We've now got 2. Now, admittedly, the 2 we've got are the most modern in the world. Now, American naval officer was saying to me, I wish we had them.
But the propellers don't work, Gordon. They've just the Queen
yeah,
Elizabeth can't get out of port because it's
the Prince of Wales is going instead. But I mean, you will always get this with anything new. You will get faults that have to be put right.
You don't think it's a sign of a more a malaise in or the military procurement or
the military procurement is a total shambles. I mean, it's a disgrace. The military are led by the ears by contractors. And the problem is that an officer, naval or army or air force, posted to the Ministry of Defence does 2 years, and there's thank Christ when he finishes and gets back to proper soldiering, if you like. Civil servants are there forever. And they're the people really, then I'm not suggesting they're bribed by contractors or anything like that. I mean, I don't think they are. I don't think the system's corrupt, but I think it's incompetent. It's inefficient. People have tried. I mean, General Sam Cowan, who if anybody could sort them out, Sam Cowan was the man who could. And he had a desperate job trying to sort out the procurement system. I mean, he improved it. He didn't manage to solve everything because his tour as head of procurement was over. But yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, things are taking far too long. There's far too much of an overrun. Contractors are not held with their nose to the grindstone and told you will produce on this cost by such a date or you don't get paid. One of the problems that has to be said on the other side is, the perfect is the enemy of the good, because the army will provide a design for, let's say, an armored car or something, and they'll start doing that, and then somebody will say, couldn't we add this? And well, it might be better if we did this, did that. So and they keep changing their mind, which is not a good idea. You want to say, this is what we want, get it made, get it into service. And yes, there may be something else that comes up that could be an improvement, but it's too late. Go ahead and produce the bloody thing.
Well, going back to the British Dreadnought then, and the design flaw that you mentioned, where you get a shell that hits the turret of the gun and it goes all the way down into the magazine. Now, call me clever after the event, but wouldn't that be something that you would want to cater for, but that you might receive incoming fire? I know they're all thinking with the Royal Navy, it's unlikely anyone's ever going to hit us, but it's a possibility.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a system. I mean, they knew that this was a risk, but the mechanics that they had installed simply weren't good enough. Whereas the Germans had. I mean, one also has to remember that the difference, Royal Navy ships had to be able to stay at sea forever, if you like, and go all around the world. Ships of the German Navy only had to be designed to stay out of sea for perhaps a few days, not for very long. I mean, all right, you got the battles around the Falklands and the First World War, naval battles, but in general they didn't. And the same thing, why was it that British naval captains in the Napoleonic Wars really quite liked being given the captaincy of a captured French ship? Because French ships were faster and more maneuverable. And the reason for that was that the Royal Navy ships had to be sturdy enough to spend, months and months and months at sea. And the crew accommodation had to be reasonably good for that reason. French ships, they didn't care much about crew accommodation. They're only going to be out for a weekend and then they're back in port. So their ships were lighter and faster for that reason. They still got sunk wherever they met the Royal Navy. But I mean, there were differences, and the British, going back to your original question, of course, the British knew that there was a risk, and they had a system in place to protect against it, which simply didn't work on a number of occasions.
Because Beatty takes over from Jellicoe, as you've mentioned, as First Sea Lord. Jutland's in 1916. Is there a difference in approach, or the fact that the German fleets return to port and doesn't come out again means that Beatty's job's been done for him by Jellicoe?
Yeah, well, the pair of them. I mean, it was.
It was very much a
Oh yeah,
tandem type
oh yeah,
thing, right?
yeah. I mean, BT is under Jellicoe, of course, as commanding the battle cruiser squadron. Um, so it's a joint business. I mean, there were all sorts of problems. There were problems of visibility. There were problems happening at night and whatnot. They tried to cut off the German retreat and couldn't. Um, and I suppose now, or even in the Second World War, with radar, that wouldn't have happened because they would have been able to work out exactly where the enemy were. But then they didn't have radar. Um, they simply weren't able to do it.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. They're both. I don't think there's anyone else naval wise we really need to mention. So let's go to
Well,
the.
we've talked. I think we talked about Cunningham last week, didn't we?
Yes, we did. We did.
He's important. We talked about him.
Right. So going back to the army, right. So I had Allenby, Plumer, Chetwood, and Wilson. Are
Hmm.
there any of those on there that shouldn't be on there?
No, I think they're all worthy of their place. Chetwood perhaps not quite so important as someone like Plumer. Plumer's important. Plumer is
Yeah, let's talk about Plumer because I'm not familiar with him.
Plumer was an Etonian like Maud, um, but he was commissioned to the York and Lancaster Regiment, which is a much more modest infantry regiment. Again, like all the soldiers of his generation, he first saw active service in the Sudan in Kitchener's war there. Went to Staff College. During the Matabele uprising in South Africa, he put together a thing called the Matabele Relief Force, which is a very interesting organization of mounted infantry, British infantry on horses. So the horse got them from A to B. They got off the horse and fought as infantry, and some Zulu levies, and they were actually pretty successful. Then again, he was in the Boer War, South African War, when that happens. 1914, he's originally he's a brigade commander quickly, and then a divisional commander, and then eventually he commands the Second Army, and he commands the Second Army, which is up on the Ypres salient, really for most of the war. He devises a system which he calls bite and hold. In other words, if you're going on the offensive, instead of simply sailing off or marching off into the wide blue yonder and keep going as long as you can, you identify objectives, you take them and you hold them and you reinforce them against the inevitable counterattack. Then you decide your next objective and on you go. And that's something that really the whole of the British Expeditionary Force adopts eventually, certainly by 1918 and the last 100 days. It's said that he was the model for Colonel Blimp because he's got a huge warm moustache. He went grey very, very quickly. It's said that he went grey in 1914 because of the stress of those early battles of Ypres. That may or may not be true, but certainly he was. He had a great shock of grey hair and great white warm moustache. And if you remember the cartoons of Colonel Blimp, look exactly like that. He was very far from being a blimp. Plumer was not a blimp. He was very, very bright. He was the genius behind the capture of Messines Ridge, which was the beginning of Third Ypres. And it happened absolutely as planned by Plumer. Terrific success, pushed the Germans back 5 or 6 miles off Messines Ridge. Now you've got Messines Ridge, you can start to try and break out in the Ypres salient. Now, unfortunately, there simply wasn't enough artillery or indeed stacks of ammunition to go straight in. If after Messines that the next day, bang, they'd tried to break out of the Ypres salient, they might have got somewhere. But there had to be a delay while the artillery was moved, while stocks of ammunition are restockpiled and everything else. And the result was that although initially it went pretty well, it got bogged down. And it was initially taken by Gough. Gough was a get up and get him, and Haig thought perfectly reasonably that was what wanted. It was Plumer's methodical planning was what was needed for Messines Ridge. After that, you wanted somebody that was, two up in bags of smoke. That didn't really work. So the battle was handed back to Plumer. Passchendaele is generally thought, or 30. Passchendaele was just one of the battles of 30. 30 is the correct term. A lot of people think it was a disaster. Actually, 30 pulled in over half the divisions that the Germans had on the Western Front, and it gave them a very bloody nose indeed. It had to be kept going because of what's happened to the French. The French army have effectively mutinied. Pétain takes over as commander-in-chief of the French army, Nivelle having got the sack, and immediately sends half the French army on leave. And so 30 has got to keep going. Haig would have closed it down when the rains broke in October, but he couldn't. He had to keep going. And this is Plumer, Second Army. It is said that Lloyd George wanted him to take over from Haig. Lloyd George, of course, wanted to get rid of Haig for reasons that we discussed the other day. Plumer made it very clear that he wasn't prepared. He didn't want the job. Lloyd George also at one stage thought of getting rid of Robertson. Now, Robertson's somebody we ought to discuss. Actually, it's not on your list, but we should. And again, Plumer made quite clear that he wasn't going to do that. Eventually, of course, he becomes a field marshal with a baton and a very high grade soldier indeed. And probably that if Haig had been killed, Plumer would have been the man to take over, I think, probably. And he could have been a very good CIGS as well.
Were there more? I guess there were more. The armies was a lot bigger, but it seems the ratio of the number of field marshals is lower than the ratio of field marshals you see even more recently. Is that a bit of?
Well, remember that the BEF is over 2 million men. So, and there's only one field marshal. That's Haig. The others all become field marshals later.
After the war.
After the war, doing different. Yeah. So they're not there. Presently, there are no. The rank still exists, but there are no field marshals. This is down to that thoroughly unpleasant man, Peter Inge, who is the last field marshal. Now, he became a field marshal because he was chief of the defence staff. And at that stage, chiefs of the defence staff were always a field marshal. And he decided that there wouldn't be any more. So he was the last. The Queen actually made Charles Guthrie a field marshal, Guthrie having been chief of the defence staff when retired. So Charles Guthrie is still around as a field marshal. John Chapel, of course, is dead not so long ago. Just trying to think. I don't think there are any.
But in the Americans very rarely promote their...
Well, they have a different system. In America, Congress is responsible for promotions. And for a very long time, Congress would not promote anybody above the rank of Major General. And this was all financial. So if you take the First World War, American Army commanders, American commanders tended usually to be a rank or two lower than their British equivalents. And they're only acting. So, for example, Pershing initially was a Major General. He's made an acting general. His two army commanders are made acting lieutenant generals, but they've all got to come back to Major General after the war because Congress doesn't want to pay them a pension, basically. It's slightly different now.
Eisenhower was a 4-star general and Montgomery was a field marshal, I think.
Yeah.
Even though he was subordinate to Eisenhower.
Yeah, correct. But Eisenhower by appointment was senior. Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander Europe.
In fact, didn't Montgomery get promoted to field marshal prior to Brooke?
No, I don't think so.
He didn't. Okay.
But I'd have to check on that. I don't think so.
Yes.
Because Brooke was a general for most of the war, as so was Montgomery, actually, come to that. Montgomery doesn't get promoted to field marshal until September 44.
Right.
I think certainly until after Overlord. It was a sort of sop because he was no longer going to be the land forces commander. Eisenhower took that over himself. And so Montgomery now will just command the British element, 21 Army Group. And that's when he was promoted to field marshal, sort of give him a bit of a boost, which would be correct actually, because normally it's divisional commanders commanded by major generals, corps commanded by lieutenant generals, armies commanded by generals, army group commanded by field marshals. So that was correct.
Right. Okay. So yeah, Plumer, had Haig been killed or died, he would have likely taken over.
I think he would be the ideal candidate. I mean, a lot would depend on. I mean, these things. Once you get to that level, these things are political. But I think Plumer would have had the confidence of the army, and I think he would be the obvious chap.
Right. Okay. Now, Allenby had a huge amount of success helping to free much of the Middle East from
Yeah,
the grip of the Ottoman Empire into
yeah,
the clutches of the British Empire.
yeah. Allenby. I mean, he initially never wanted to be a soldier. Allenby wanted to join the Indian Civil Service, and he took the exam, I think, at least twice, maybe three times, and failed. So he didn't get into the
It
civil
was
service.
tougher to get into the Indian civil service than the British civil service, I think.
Yeah, I think it probably was because once you went to the Indian Civil Service, you had responsibility. It was all like joining the Indian Army. You got responsibility far greater than your British equivalent. So if you joined the Indian Army, you would command a company as a lieutenant, probably. Whereas, in the British Army, to be at least a senior captain, possibly a major. So the civil service was the same. I mean, you could be I remember a chap that I served under, who was one of the sort of last of the Raj, and he commanded. I remember him telling me that he commanded an area the size of Wales, and he was a subaltern. I mean, he was a youngster, and he had 300 soldiers and 200 camels, I think it was. And this is way up in Rajasthan. So they got, and that's why it was very difficult to get into it. So poor old Allenby didn't get in. And I don't think he was particularly academic anyway. I mean, he was commissioned into the into Stirling Dragoon Guards, sixth Dragoons. Did go to Staff College. He all his reports from Staff College said that he was always prepared to listen, was not a great debater, but was generally sensible. Was the sort of thing they said about him. He was popular with his peers. They elected him to be master of the Sandhurst and Staff College Draghounds. This is something that Haig wanted to be and didn't get. I, as a past master of Sandhurst and Staff College Draghounds, so Allenby got it. So he was popular with his friends. Of course, actually, funny, he went to South Africa. As they all did of that generation. And he took with him a pack of foxhounds. So he clearly was a good chap, the right sort of idea. And I think the descendants of those foxhounds are still there. Will they still hunt in South Africa or not? I have no idea. But that's what he did.
Perhaps some listeners can let us know.
Yeah. I mean, there aren't any foxes as far as I know, but they might hunt. It's all like India where they still hunt jackals. I mean, the Peshawar Vale, which is in Pakistan, they still hunt, but they hunt jackals rather than foxes. But they do it properly. I mean, they pink goats and all the rest of it. So Allenby then, come the First World War, come 1914, he's initially commanding a cavalry division and then the 2-division cavalry corps. He does well, I think. Now he's criticized for Lecato, I think unfairly, actually. I think Lecato had to happen. John French thought it shouldn't have happened, but it had to happen. It's the only way to stop the Germans and hand them off. But it was, and of course, Smith Dorian was the corps commander at Lecato. Allenby was the cavalry rearguard, really, who were sort of finding out where the Germans were, where they were coming from. And he did well there. But where he really made his name was when he sent off to Palestine, where he ends up being the commander in chief there. That's where all his sort of cavalry business really can be used, because there was never going to be the great arme blanche, advance to charge to Berlin. That wasn't going to happen on the Western Front. Wire, machine guns, all the rest of it. But of course, when he gets to Palestine, it's open country. It's ideal for cavalry. And of course, he recaptures or captures Jerusalem. and he's quite clever there because he dismounts. He doesn't ride into Jerusalem. He gets off and he walks in on his feet, and that pleases all religions that are interested in Jerusalem. You know, the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews. So he's made his name. As Palestine made him, actually. I mean, he's a perfectly competent cavalry commander on the Western Front, but it's Palestine that makes his name. Known as the Bull, Allenby.
And he had quite a good relationship with Lawrence, didn't he?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the Lawrence thing. Lawrence was one of the much British history is made by lunatics. They're always quite interesting lunatics. Lawrence, I think, was one of them. Yeah, I mean, Allenby was quite happy for. I mean,
Well, we should actually. I wonder if we should have included Lawrence in this list.
Lawrence was a very junior officer, really.
But he had a huge amount of influence in a large land area.
Not quite as much as everybody thinks. I mean, wonderful film, Lawrence of Arabia. But yes, he was, and of course his book, you know, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. That's well read, and I don't think that what he did was as important as people tend to think. Now, I'll have all sorts of people telling me I'm talking rubbish. I think what he did in its own way was important. He had a good relationship with the Arabs. He made all sorts of promises to them
that he couldn't keep. Yeah.
Not his fault that they couldn't be kept, but he should never have made them in the first place. I mean, if you make a promise, you want to be bloody sure that you're able to carry it out. And of course, he couldn't for all sorts of reasons. And then he really got very odd indeed. I mean, he went off, as you know, he joined the Royal Air Force as an aircraftsman, and then it was discovered who he was, and eventually he kills himself on a motorbike.
Yes. It's
so he's
his tie, because he goes to the Treaty of Versailles. It's very interesting.
He's turned. He's up there on the various conferences as to what's going to happen, and he's very much pushing for.
Yeah, he's not into Sykes-Picot at all.
No, he's not involved in that. I was certain about something with Sykes-Picot, actually. But there we go. Yeah, I mean, the Ottoman Empire's collapsed. What are you going to do with it? You know, and the British are interested, and the French are interested. The Americans are interested in self-determination, but they really have no influence over what happens in the Middle East.
But Allenby does actually manage to navigate his way through that pretty effectively.
Yeah, it's a very difficult minefield, and yes, he does navigate his way through it. Yeah. And the result would, I think, if the Second World War hadn't come along, then things might have been perfectly all right in the Middle East. But that's not what happened.
Well, another commander who I mentioned, and I think you might not think he should be on this list, but should we just deal with him quickly as to why he shouldn't be, which is Philip Chetwood. He goes to the Middle East, doesn't he? He avoids too much involvement in.
I mean, he's a perfectly competent operator. There's not much more you can say about him, really. I mean, the chap who really makes a difference in the Middle East or Mesopotamia, of course, is Maud, who gets there when the thing is a shambles, frankly.
This is the other Etonian.
Are you an Etonian?
Gordon, I've never been so insulted.
No, Harrovian.
So I'm afraid I'm not a fan of either Plumer or Maud.
Yeah, so when I say that Maud was an Etonian, you're immediately at him. All right. Well, he was an Etonian, but they didn't have a lot of money, actually. He was always concerned that, I mean, he was always trying to get staff jobs because he could then live on his pay, whereas command wasn't going to be so easy. Particularly, he was commissioned to the Coldstream Guards. Now, that meant that they spent a lot of time in London. The Brigade of Guards, the monarch's personal troops, and for a long time, Guards battalions weren't allowed to serve east of Suez. They had to be near enough to be recalled should the nation be in danger. That, of course, long gone. But at the time, this was the case. And of course, if you're in London, it's very expensive. It's expensive now. If you're a guard subaltern in London, it's not cheap. I mean, as we all know. I mean,
they have to live south of the river now, Gordon.
Well, I know, it's frightful. Well, I mean, I was having lunch at Rules last week, and Rules is a wonderful restaurant, and the quality is always the same, hasn't changed at all.
I've
Well,
never been. I've
okay.
always wanted to go, actually.
Oh, you must go to it. It was wonderful, super restaurant, really is. Excellent food, best steak and kidney pie in England. No, it's very, very good. But it's now, it's 50 quid a head without the second bottle of claret. You know, it's prices go up and up and up. So Plumer commissioned to the Coldstream, not a lot of private money. He's always been a bit pushed at that sort of level. Plenty of active service. He sees active service in the Sudan, of course, Kitchener's War in the Sudan, South African War. He does find himself a staff job as responsible for, he organizes all the celebrations for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And then he's off to South African War, of course. 1914, he's actually only a colonel in 1914 when the war breaks out. Very quickly, he's a brigade commander and then a divisional commander in the Dardanelles. In fact, he's there. He lands in Suvla Bay. It's never, Dardanelles, Gallipoli was never going to work. There's nothing that Maud as a divisional commander can do to make it work. And eventually, of course, he's sent off to Mesopotamia. He becomes the commander in chief there, and he finds the situation is not good. The administration has broken down. There are sort of medical problems. Soldiers are suffering from everything from beriberi to malaria, and he gets a grip, and he really sorts it out, and things are looking up, and he starts to push back the Turks, and things are really looking good. He was offered a cup of coffee in a Jewish school, and he said, "Thank you very much, and could he have some milk with it?" And he somebody produced a jug of milk, and he poured that into his coffee and drank it. And the milk was contaminated. Nobody's fault. It wasn't trying to poison him or anything like that. The result was he got cholera and he died, which is a shame because we still defeated the Turks. But it would have been nice if he'd gone on. And
from a cup of coffee. Wow.
Yeah, a cup of coffee and milk. And that I think that's why we now pasteurize milk, I think.
Yes.
Although when I was a boy, my grandfather was a farmer, and we would always go there for Christmas and that sort of thing. And the milk, one of the girls would be sent down to one of the chaps to milk the cow, and the great jug of milk we brought, we all drank it, and it wasn't pasteurized, and it didn't do us any harm at all. So quite why Maud's milk gave him cholera, I don't know, but for some means it was contaminated.
Well, maybe stored in a warm climate, maybe
rife started to go off. Yeah.
Well, Louis Pasteur, I don't think had appeared by then.
No, he hadn't. I can't remember his exact.
He's from Arbois, which I do recommend visiting.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, Gordon,
that's the end of Maud.
And I think that's around about the end of our podcast, because Maud, his fatal cup of coffee, is quite a good way to end it. I think
the chap we ought to talk about if there's another opportunity is Robertson.
Is Robertson? He's not First World War, is he?
Yeah, he's chief.
Is he?
He's CIGS for most of the war.
Right, Gordon. Sorry. Now Robertson, he's interesting because. Am I right in saying that he rose from the ranks?
Yeah. Now he's fascinating. Nobody's ever done it before, and then couldn't do it now. I mean, Robertson was born in the most humble circumstances. His father was a small-time tailor. Both his parents were illegitimate. He went to the village school, left school, I think, at the age of 12. Went into domestic service. He was a servant in somebody's house. As soon as he was 17, joined the army, enlisted as a trooper, as a private soldier in the cavalry. He gets promoted reasonably quickly, lance corporal, sergeant. He becomes, after about 10 years, he becomes what they call a troop sergeant major. Now that's equivalent of a staff sergeant or a colour sergeant today. And then his officer thinks, this is a bright boy. And after 11 years in the ranks, he's commissioned as a second lieutenant. That's extraordinary. Extraordinary for it couldn't happen now, and it would be extraordinary then. But obviously his talents were realized. Now he did, unlike most private soldiers of the time whose sole interest was drink and women, probably in that order, Robertson hardly drank and he read a huge amount. He educated himself, if you like. He spoke 6 Indian languages, plus French and German. He taught himself those. I didn't learn that at school. So he was obviously a natural linguist. He was obviously very intelligent. And once commissioned, he's in a cavalry regiment. Unfortunately, the regiment goes to India, where he can sort of live on his pay as long as he doesn't drink.
Cavalry officer is expensive, and he has no money.
Yeah, and he's got no money. And for example, pipes were not allowed in the mess, and the only form of tobacco that he could afford was pipe tobacco, so he didn't smoke. In the mess, only cigars were permitted, no pipes, so he couldn't even smoke. He was a tremendously hard worker. He was naturally very intelligent. He never, and it was a great disappointment to him, he never commanded men from then on, never commanded troops. He spent his entire service on the staff, very often the intelligence staff, which he did very good. And he was an extremely good intelligence officer, able to run networks, to collate, and everything else. By the time of the Second World War, First World War, he's the quartermaster general to Sir John French. So he's the head logistic officer in French's BEF, and the retreat from Mons, which was a pretty painful retreat all the way back to the Marne. The reason that succeeded was very largely due to Robertson, because Robertson had thought right from the beginning, we are probably going to have to retreat. French didn't think that, but Robertson did. He knew that we were going to be hugely outnumbered. He knew that on the left were only territorials, French territorials. Well, they wouldn't stand, he didn't think. And on the right was the French army, and he thought the French army would probably withdraw, and if they did, he'd have to as well. And he had planned previously and stockpiled every sort of half day's march. There was a ration dump, an ammunition dump, and so on, all the way back. So that was him. He then.
Can I ask, Gordon, was he popular? Because, particularly cavalry regiment, rather one imagines snobbish institution. Yeah. Is he popular, or does he suffer from?
Yeah, no, he's very well liked. There are some accounts that his mess bill was paid by the other officers without telling him. He'd have been highly offended if he'd known. But
wasn't he wondering where all these drinks were coming from then?
Well, no, he just didn't drink. He drank water. Right. He didn't drink. And of course, he was commissioned not into his own regiment, commissioned into another cavalry regiment. But yeah, he seems to be. He was highly respected, and certainly when he became chief of the Imperial General Staff, as he did very early on, nobody questions it. He is the man for the job. He's got a very good brain. He has his Yorkshire accent for the rest of his life. I mean, he's known affectionately as Wally. I mean, his name was William. He's Wally. And he had a broad accent, never bothered to change it. And when summoned to the cabinet, and they would make some suggestion to him, and he was a great one for saying, "I've heard different," and that was it. He was a great supporter of Haig. He and Haig get on exceedingly well together, funnily enough. I mean, they're from completely different extremes of society. I mean, Haig is moneyed gentry, admittedly trade, but nevertheless. Whereas Robertson is, left school, illegitimate parents, terrible, humble situation, ex-domestic service. And here he is as a field marshal. He's the other field marshal because he's the chief of the Imperial General Staff. And he supports Haig, right? I mean, he protects Haig from the machinations of people like Lloyd George and his satraps.
It's amazing, really. It really is amazing to go from private to field marshal in the British Army.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. You couldn't do it now. I mean, he was 28, I think, when he was actually commissioned.
So that's very old for.
Which is very old.
Yeah.
Now the upper age limit actually for Sandhurst is 28, which I think is far too high, but there it is. But if now you went at 28, there's no way you could become anything other than you might make major. You might. You certainly wouldn't get any higher than that. It's because you can't get all the courses in and the requisite regimental duty and everything else. So you couldn't do it now. To do it then in the 1880s was extraordinary, extraordinary, and it says quite a lot for the system. That here's this chap who's from the most humble of origins, with his broad Yorkshire accent, and he's got the respect of the whole of the army. And you never hear, I mean, you'd expect there to be snide remarks from some, but there aren't. You know, I mean, he's proved himself that he can do the business. As CIGS, he's very good at deciding what's a priority and what isn't. He was, I may say, he was commandant of the Staff College prior to that. Now, to put a man like that in as commandant of the Staff College, you really do have to have total faith in him, because the Staff College is the organization that produces the generals of tomorrow. So the commandant has got to be somebody that you've got total confidence in, and you know will manage a training regimen that will produce these sort of people. So that's the sort of confidence the system had in him.
Was he quite similar to Brooke then? They have similar roles, one in the First World War, one in the Second World War. Are they?
Yes.
Their skills are similar, I suppose.
Yeah,
maybe
except
not characters.
that of course, the army in the First World War was much bigger than it was in the Second World War. But yeah, same job, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. And whereas Brooke had to try and keep Churchill under control, Robertson had to try and keep Lord George under control. He didn't have a problem with Asquith. Asquith, in fact, was very much in favour of Robertson. Lord George didn't like Robertson because Robertson would defend Haig and stop Lord George from interfering with Haig. Then after the war, Robertson commands the British Army of Occupation in Germany, the British Army of the Rhine.
It's an extraordinary story, Robertson. So I'm feeling very stupid now for not having included him.
No, I'd say it's people tend to overlook him, but he's very important. And as I say, he's a one-off. Nobody had ever done it before or since, and you simply couldn't today.
Well, yeah, he's a real life Richard Sharp.
Yes, there were lots of Richard Sharps, but in fact, during that Napoleonic period, but they tended not to get higher than some got to major. None really got any higher than that. The problem with them was that once the war stopped, of course, they didn't have the money to purchase commission. The Richard Sharps, and there were loads of Richard Sharps at regimental duty, and they had got their promotion either because there was a vacancy caused by death, which the commander-in-chief could fill without purchase, or they'd led a forlorn hope, they could get promoted without purchase, or they'd taken dispatches back, promoted without purchase. And of course, when the war was going on, there were lots of opportunities. Once the war stops, the Richard Sharps can get no further. And Wellington said the trouble was that they all turned to drink. So yeah. So I mean, in a sense, Robertson was the only Richard Sharp of his generation.
Wonderful way to end it, Gordon. That's been extraordinary. Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic. So, well, next we need to move, and I'm going to give you plenty of time to relax and gather your strength for the Victorian era. We'll go back to sort of the South African War and further back. There are plenty of imperial wars to talk about and commanders involved.
Well, we've got people like Roberts and Wolsey, and lots of them.
Yes, and Havelock and Redvers Buller. There are some great Victorian names here, aren't there?
Yeah. Buller's an interesting one. Most of what's that book by the engineer that had his hand blown off? The Psychology of Military Incompetence. He's very critical of Buller. I think slightly unfairly, but there we go. Yes.
Wonderful stuff, Gordon. This has been great. Thank you.
Okay, old chap. See you soon.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do get in touch if you've got any comments. But until then, thank you and good night.